What is the scariest folklore story you have ever heard? Part 1. Story 1. Easily the Yi Naldolshil, or skinwalkers. It translates to roughly, by this way they travel on four legs. It's one of the four witching ways, alongside the frenzy way, the wizardry way, and the sorcery way. The origins of the legend extend back in their legends to their emergence from the flood of the third world into the fourth world, or the world as we know it, having left their creators behind in the flood and saved by the children of the ants. The Dinle, people, had lost much of the wisdom of how to live. They prayed for guidance and did dances and performed ceremonies for guidance, and were answered by the holy people of the sky. These people had lived here before and were wise, and knew how to live in harmony with Mother Earth and Father Sky, and taught the Dinle, who were from the ground and called the ground people, the bright or shining ways, all of which eventually made up the Navajo way. Those who were blessed by the land and the gods were taught special ways for using medicine and magic, for the good of the people. However, some of the holy people were jealous of some of the things being shared, and the things the Dinle brought from the worlds below, and taught some ways of corruption. Those were the ways of the Navajo witch, the most well-known being the witchery, whose practitioners became Ye Naldoshil. These were medicine men and women, who were also taught the witch to know how to guard the people against it, but fell to corruption. While medicine is still practiced in the reservations, so too is the belief that witchcraft is as well. And while there are proud families of medicine men, there are also secret families of witches, passing down the witching ways through generations. Skinwalkers are told to be able to change form into any animal they desire, to suit their individual needs. They can run as fast as cars and have been reputed to be strong enough to break stone. Looking in a skinwalker's eyes is supposed to paralyze you and inflict you with sickness. Abductions of children and close family members of the Yi Nadolosili are attributed to them, and some of the people say that a final ceremony, to become one, involves murdering a family member or close friend. This isn't folklore to them either. The Navajo take it deadly seriously, or generally refuse to talk about it to outsiders, probably because they don't want to bring attention to themselves. This story actually sounds really cool. I've heard of skinwalkers before, but never really understood the lore behind them, other than the fact that they're supposedly really tall, or people will take pictures of dogs whose eyes look like humans and claim they're skinwalkers. Story 2. St. Petersburg, Florida, where the truth is much darker than the legend. The mini lights have been an urban legend amongst the African American community here for a while. Around children's parks in Booker Creek, it is said that if any children are out past dark, the mini lights, large green orbs of light, would come out and kill them. The lights were said to be the spirits of two dwarves that stayed behind with Minnie when P.T. Barnum and Bailey blew through town somewhere in the early 1900s. Now, Minnie was the name of an old woman said to be a witch that somehow inherited the land despite being a newly freed slave. So understandably, people were suspicious. Rumors circulated that Minnie was a witch and had access to black magic, further alienating the old woman. It was said that Minnie never liked people poking around her property, and often sent out her little men to chase off anyone who trespassed. And this continued every day until the old Minnie's death. That was the legend. The truth is, long ago, the Brooker Creek and Childs Park area had been home to many newly freed slaves after the war. But just because a law passed didn't mean that everything was hunky-dory. Hunting alligators was a pastime that netted big money for alligator skin, heads, and meat, especially during the growth of the tourism businesses in the early 1900s. But hunting alligators was no easy task. You had to have guns, hunting dogs, a kerosene lamp to find the gators, as their eyes shone in the dark, and of course, threat, goats, sheep, and farm animals were used, often tied at the bank of the rivers, but that could get expensive. So sometimes hunters improvised, and if they had little worth in fellow human beings, then bait was plentiful. Raids into the African American settlements were frequent. They waited until after dark and sent out their hounds looking to grab anyone they could drag off, the easiest being children, and so for generations, children were warned to not be out past dark unless they would disappear. Nearly 100 years later, The legend of Minnie's light served to scare children back indoors to avoid being victims of hate crimes. But sometimes legends take on a life of their own, for to this day, people in those communities still claim to have seen the Minnie lights. This story honestly made me really sad, especially considering the fact that it was African American children who were being captured, and that an African woman was being blamed for it. My heart really goes out to Minnie. I'm sure she didn't have an easy life, but at least it means that this tale keeps kids safe now, right? Story 3. Lezi are basically forest protectors, so basically the Slavic version of the Lorax. They kind of just hang out with animals when they migrate. Lezi can shapeshift into many different forms. As a human, he looks like a poor person with glowing eyes, and his shoes are on backwards. If you become friends with the Lezi, you can learn the secrets of magic. Farmers and shepherds would make pacts with the Lezi to protect their crops and sheep. Lezi likes to trick people just to mess with them. He likes to lure people into getting lost, make them sick, or the favorite of the Lezi, tickling them to death. They also hate axes and will go look for them and hide them in their lair. If a person gets lost in the woods and a Lezi crosses their path, you have to turn your clothes inside out and wear shoes on opposite feet. If not, then the Lezi will tickle you to death. Lezi are very mischievous creatures. They have horrid screams, like a fisher cat, and can imitate the voices of people to trick lost people in the forest. They use that to lure them back to their caves, where Lezi will tickle them to death. They also remove signs from their posts just to make sure people get lost. Lezi aren't totally evil, although they enjoy misguiding humans and kidnapping young women. They love animals, so they often keep grazing cattle from wandering too far into the forest and getting lost or eaten. Sometimes cowherders will make deals with the Lezi by handing him a cross and sharing communion with the Lezi after Christian church gatherings. Those deals are said to give the cowherds special powers. This story from my babsia, grandmother, kept me out of the forest as a kid. Being tickled to death sounds horrid. I completely agree with the OP. Being tickled to death sounds horrid. And I don't know, they sound nice, but being a young woman myself, I think I should probably avoid these guys. Story 4. I was reading a book on Finnish folklore and was surprised when the most brutal story was about tontis, gnomes, elves, homekeepers. In modern world, they're often described in an affectionate way, but they used to be some malevolent creepers. People believe in tontis for a very long time. It was said they only really disappeared alongside electric lighting in households because there were no more dark corners for tontis to hide in. They were described as scary-looking creatures, sometimes originating from the previous dead owners of the house. Thought to keep the house safe and thriving as long as you left them food. And in this story, the last session of the sauna, you weren't supposed to go to the sauna after midnight, because that's when it's the tontis turn. Well, there's a cheeky wench who gave a rat's ass about this rule and decided to go anyway. Everyone was telling her not to, but she was stubborn. Time passes, and there's no word of the wench. The people go to see if she's still in there, but all that's left of her is her flayed skin hanging on a perch. Some traditionally creepier stuff are likyos, who are the lost souls of children who've been buried and hidden in the woods after childbirth, with no christening. They scared people by crying and screaming, but sometimes they were helpful and pointed out trees that were about to fall. Sometimes they're described the same as vervatuli, will-o-wisp, and lure people deeper into bogs and forests. Panajanen, also the Finnish word for nightmare, literally translated, it would be something like the one who presses, pana equals press, was a creature who sat on a sleeping person's chest, caused them bad dreams, and scared the bejesus out of them. Later, it was determined it was an explanation for sleep paralysis. Story 5. An English village near me has a large old mansion owned by a local family. Most of the rooms in the mansion haven't been touched for years due to the size of the house, and the family refuses to go into them, partly due to the fact that there's not enough people living in the house and partly due to hauntings. The house, apparently, dates back to before the English Civil War, and the family living there were a well-known Catholic family. So, of course, became a base for the king's soldiers. Cavaliers, I think they were called. The king lost the Civil War, and the family who lived there says that they can hear the soldiers stomping around the hallways at night. and occasionally barking orders. They also claim there's a bunch of other ghosts, such as a veiled woman in black, who only appears to you if you're ill in that house. A librarian who will shush people talking in the library room. Yes, it's that big a house. A young girl who you can only see through some of the frosted glass doors in the house. Banging noises and screaming coming from the sitting room at night. And finally, a man dressed in black who wanders the garden at midday. And these are just the few tales I remember. Even if you don't believe in ghosts, there's still tons of creepy stuff about that house, such as tiny rooms hidden everywhere for priests to hide in, known as priest holes, a hidden room below the house that leads out to a nearby river, and hidden passageways all around the house. Story 6. This one I heard at Sap Fest, harvesting maple sap, in northern Wisconsin. I'm not sure if it's well known since I only ever heard it from my family. It's called The Buried Boy, and it comes out of this song we sing while at Sap Fest. It's pretty much just singing about a guy sitting on the riverbank with his sweetheart, while he talks about his older brother who was murdered and buried by his dad. According to the story, the older brother rose up that night and killed his dad as payback, except for his eyes had already been eaten by birds, so he didn't see that his father was dead. So he kept wandering around searching for his father in order to kill him. So he wanders around the woods searching for his father in order to get revenge. He bangs on the doors and windows of log cabins, and if he finds it open, he'll come in and murder everyone. Also, if you pass by his grave, across the riverbank in the song, he'll know and he'll stalk you through the trees. It doesn't seem as scary in a city, but when you get separated from everyone in the woods and the sun is setting, or when you're trying to sleep and the wind is banging against the door, it gets a lot scarier. I still don't like crossing rivers at night, even in a car over a bridge. I don't know, man. I can totally understand OP's fear, especially if the guy keeps coming back to try to murder his father, but he can't see him. Sounds like a really weird tale to tell it, probably a really nice thing. I've been to a sap fest before, and trust me, it's a lot more fun. Story 7. My mom has a little cottage in the woods of northern Italy. It's a really comfy place, but it has no electricity or warm water, so everything has to be heated up in a wood-powered oven, and the only light source is either external electricity, i.e. lamps with batteries. Not much of a problem, really. It's great there and I love it. The thing is, there's only one small dirt road leading there, and there is always something wrong with it. Every time we get there, some part of the road is damaged or destroyed, or not visible under an unreasonable amount of dead leaves, even if it's summer. When questioning the people in the next village, Rocco Sanglina Masacara, cool name, I know, about it, most people become really defensive and try to change the subject. We've gotten some information out of a few people, though, and it scares me a bit. Even though I don't believe in the supernatural, they believe there's a thing they called aurore, horror, in the forest, trying to get people to lose sight of their tracks so it can have new playmates. The whole story is super interesting but unbelievable. We figured that the damage to the road is due to wild hogs digging for food, but we still can't find an explanation for the leaves being placed exactly onto the road. Oh well, I suppose it's just folklore, right? Story 8. Wendigo. An Ojibwe myth to explain cannibalism despite bountiful food supplies. Stories tend to originate around people either committing cannibalism or being forced to when lost in the forest. The latter has some story element involving hearing your name being called on the wind and water, and creatures in the forest. And if you finally give it an answer, you've allowed the spirit of the Wendigo in. It was a law until the mid-20th century that anyone suspected of being possessed by a Wendigo should immediately be put to death, or risk devouring the entire village or town, or passing the spirit on to another host. Algernon Blackwood wrote the first fictional story with the Wendigo. It is one of the creepiest stories I've ever read, and was an influence on H.P. Lovecraft, among many others. It's a long read, but the build-up is fantastic. 2 moments in particular caused me to not want to ever go camping alone. These stories come from all over the world, though it has its origin in Canada. Other countries with similar monsters, it has been discovered, have now realized that these are the effects of rabies and kuru, a disease that you become infected with by eating the brain of an infected person. It was common in Papua New Guinea due to the consumption of bodies after death to release the spirit. Story 9. Tallypo, American folk legend about a giant cat-like creature that stalks the woods at night. In the original legend, an old hermit hunter shoots its misses, and instead it ends up shooting its tail off. Tallypo is startled and manages to escape, satisfied with the tail. The hunter takes it home to make stew out of it. Later that night, Tallypo manages to break into his home. Tallypo jumps on the man's bed and asks where Tallypo is. The man, scared shitless, answers that he ate it. Tallypo is enraged and, as an act of vengeance, claws the man's stomach out and destroys his house to rubble. In some children's versions, the hunter only loses his house. But most versions include a hunting dog that also dies in the scuffle. Other versions also have the legend last for a few days rather than one night, where the hunter is stalked by the creature every night. But the basic story is still the same. First time I heard it as a kid, I was living in Alabama, and it scared the absolute shit out of me since my grandma's house was right in front of a huge plot of woods. It's easy to imagine horror and folklore legends from other countries miles away, but the local stuff freaks me out. Story 10. When I lived in an Australian outback town in the middle of nowhere, our Indigenous Studies teacher, who is Aboriginal, loved to tell us stories. She scared all the first graders straight by telling us never to go out into the desert alone, because there lives a monster who is always thirsty. He's always trying to find water, but never can because it hardly rains. So, when plump and juicy children become lost in the desert, he jumps on them and drinks all their blood. All he leaves behind are the dry husks of children for their parents to find. I am sure she was just trying to deter us from wandering off into the bushland, but it left a memorable imprint. I've forgotten the monster's name. Another popular Aboriginal tale is the Tiddalik. Tiddalik was a giant frog who drank all the water in the world. As the other creatures began to die from thirst, they plotted to make Tiddalik laugh. Everyone failed except Nabanum, the eel, who danced and tied himself into knots. Tiddalik laughed uproariously, releasing all the water and filling the rivers and lakes. Many of the creatures drowned in the process or were left stranded on new islands. The concept of a giant laughing frog scared the cookies off me as a 6-year-old. I get sometimes adults try to tell kids scary stories to protect them, but the fact that a teacher told that to first graders who were probably 6 or 7 is a little insane to me. Story 11. Our village has one, called Balas. What makes it creepy is that she isn't some obscure, identified being. People know women who are called Balas. They have normal families and stuff, so she's literally living amongst you. She stalks people at night. That's when she's usually in a ghoulish form, feet turned backwards and shit. She gets sick a day before someone in the vicinity is about to die, and then becomes very healthy the day they do die. She can turn into different creatures and attack you while you're alone. Then you will fall sick, and if she visits you in her human form while you're sick, you'll die. And you can't refuse her coming in. Sounds silly, and it is, but it is still creepy. And there's another one about music of the dead. Our traditional music has flutes and some forms of drums in it. It's said that people will often hear the music coming from a distance, but the flute will be missing. You're supposed to ignore it because that's the music of dead or otherworldly beings. If you don't ignore it, then they'll notice you too. We have a lot of weird stuff like that. I guess people had to have good stories to keep themselves entertained. Story 12. This wasn't folklore, but my friend's uncle told us a story that's creeped me out ever since I heard it. He was telling us how he used to work a large farm in Mexico when he was younger, and he had only been there for about 2 months. At one end of the farm was an older house with dark trees all around it, and he noticed that the animals never went to that side, and he would always see someone walking back and forth at the edge of the fence, like they wanted it. One day the animals went to that side, so he went over there too, and he could see the person passing back and forth. As he got closer, he noticed it was a woman because her hair was really long and dropped in front of her face. As he walked up to introduce himself, her head shot up, and she stared at him with completely black eyes. He said her face resembled a horse because it was so long and disfigured. As he backed away, she started to climb the fence and then chased him. She chased him all the way to his house, which is about 1 mile away. He never went back to work. I wonder if there are any other stories or legends about that particular house or area. I can't imagine encountering someone or something with completely black eyes and a horse-like face. It's understandable why your friend's uncle never went back to work at that farm. Story 13. I think I would go with Rattenfanger von Heimen. It is a German tale. There is this man who comes into town, which is filled with rats. He offers the villagers his help. They take his offer and promise him a fair payment. So he walks around town playing the flute. He plays it so well that every rat leaves its hiding spot to follow him. He walks out of town and brings the rats away. After this, he returns, demanding his payment. The villagers are afraid of him and refuse to pay. They even try to force him away. He leaves before he gets harm. One night, when the moon was at its highest, he came back and walked around town one more time playing the flute. This time, every child in the town comes outside to see him playing. The kids love his play, so they follow him around. So this man wanders around until he has every single child in town in his tracks and he leaves. The next morning, the parents wake to see every kid gone. No one could find them, and no one heard of him anymore. Story 14. On the big island of Hawaii, there are the Night Marchers, which are the ghosts of the Kau warriors who died in a volcanic eruption after a battle. Their footprints are actually still preserved in Kaluuya National Park. I've had a lot of people, both locals and people from the mainland, tell me of hearing a large group of men marching and chanting late at night around Kauai. You apparently smell sulfur, and you have to get naked and lay in a fetal position. I've heard other people say you just can't look at them, and if you do, you'll die. I've had some friends tell me they were camping in a remote valley when they heard about 20 people marching by speaking Hawaiian, and they smelled sulfur. They didn't see anyone since they were in a tent. Also had an old Hawaiian uncle tell me when he was a teenager working on a ranch at night he saw, and purple light go from Kalua to Manoa, Iowa. And the next day, Mauna Iowa erupted for the first time in a while. It was sometime in the 80s. Story 15. I'm from northern Brazil near the Amazon River. My grandma always told us the story of Mataya Paria. At night, you can hear her whistle. She's like a witch. If she finds you in the forest, she's gonna beat you with a leash that she has. The Matita Paria is a normal human in daylight. She can beat anyone from the village. It's like a curse. When you hear her whistle, you can call her 3 times. You would scream, "Matita, come drink coffee." And the next morning, she would visit you in her human form to drink coffee with you. So you could find out who she is. But there's a catch. She would come real early in the morning. You should have coffee and a cigar for her. Otherwise, she would kill you. Everybody who would still be asleep when she arrives would fall ill and die. It was really creepy for me growing up, but today I know that the whistle is a bird. In Brazil, we have a lot of those folklore stories. It's funny to think that the whistle that was thought to be her calling card turned out to be just a bird. But I can see how growing up with that story could be really creepy. It's cool that there are so many different folklore stories in Brazil and around the world, and they all have their own unique twist. Story 16. Scariest one I've heard in real life? The cave people. If you explore caves, you've probably heard them, the quiet little whispers. They sound like a group talking way off in the impenetrable darkness. I've heard a dozen different versions of what they are. Lost souls, dwarves, evil spirits, or the logical explanation, drops of water echoing, and your mind playing tricks. Either way, it's a common joke that we all carry 3 sources of light, so that it never goes out, because if it does, they'll come for you. Or it's because it's true darkness down there and you'll likely get lost and fall in a pit. It's a rite of passage for young cavers to be frightened with the stories by older vets. Though I've met a few who really swear to have full conversations with the specters. No matter how you shake it, I'm a giant wimp and still don't like caving alone, or getting too far from my group, or turning out my light for more than a few minutes. Story 17. The Drog of Norwegian Folklore. Norway is a country that has a giant coastline, with cold seas and plenty of storms. So naturally, one of our creepiest pieces of folklore would be based around it. The Drog is the spirit of a sailor taken by storms. Their ships were shattered and their bodies pooled beneath the waves, never to set foot on land again. Now they sail within the storm in their broken boats, bodies cold and bloated, covered in seaweed and barnacles. If you find your vessel trapped in a terrible storm, you might see one, and if you do, you will never set foot on land again. The Drog will come out of the storm, grab hold of you, and drag you into your watery grave. The idea of being pulled into a watery grave by the Drog is definitely a frightening thought for anyone who spends time on the sea. Story 18. Arang Minyak, the oily man in Malay. He's a shaman or supernatural being entirely covered in tar or black oil. He gains and increases his powers by abducting and raping virgins. While I studied in Malaysia, a few girls were raped on our campus, and somehow Orang Manyak was blamed. The rumor spread like fire. One weekend, there was literally an exodus of students all in panic, because most of them firmly believed we were being attacked by Orang Manyak. Most of the international students were just in disbelief. Story 19. If you hear the scream of a livid woman who is determined to kill you, strip your outer layer of clothing where you stand and sprint, because the mountain witch will take your clothes as a tribute. Adirondack Mountains growing up. Turns out it was mountain lions. Way scarier than a witch. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.